Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Uh, First of all, to open our discussion here in my first YouTube channel and in my first video, of course, and say thank you to Mrs. Ratna Hartanto because give to us to big opportunities, which is we made some video to fulfill our final exams, and maybe it's additional, but it's really interesting for me. Thank you, Mrs. Ratna Hartanto. And then let me introduce myself. My name is Aryana Widyaningsih from Universitas Islam Indonesia. Now I'm in 5 semester in a program international program in law faculty, and now this video is explain or discussing about the obligation subject, or we know that as a perikatan. And this video will consist of the three part. The first, I will explain about obligation and the element of the obligation, and the second is about the contract, a definition of the contract, and the last is about the principle of the contract. So hope you will enjoy watching my video. And we started understanding about the obligation and the contract. I divided this video into three parts. The first, I will explain about what the meaning of the obligation itself, and then I will explain about the meaning of the contract, and then I will explain about the regulation that regulate about the contract, and the last I will section is about obligation. First, in Indonesia, we already know that obligation have meaning as kewajiban, but in this subject, the meaning of the obligation itself is hukum perikatan. So you have to understand first that in here that I mentioned obligation is as perikatan in Indonesian meanings. Now I will make a definition about the obligation law, but it's referred in several books and opinion of some scholar. Now the definition of obligation itself is legal relationship between limited legal subject related to a person or several persons bind themselves to act asking certain ways to other parties which have the rights. Or in the simple meaning, we can conclude that obligation is as a legal relationship between, it can be limited liability with the person or person with person, which can appear some obligation or some rights that have by two parties. So in here it can be concluded that perikatan or obligation itself can make some rights and obligation in the both of parties. Before I already talk about the obligation itself, and here we move to the contract. Why contract are really important to discuss in this video? Because contract itself can make an obligation, such as we know debtor and creditor. In here, before they have an obligation, they did or they done a contract. So we move to the definition of the contract. Based on ICC Article 3030, an agreement is an act pursuant to which one or more individual commits themselves to one another. So we can mention that the contract is done by individuals, but it can be one or more. I think in the reality, the contract can be done more than three parties, and but if we are referred to the ICC, it's mentioned that one or more individual that have commit. Now, why it's commit is really important in here, because in the context of commit itself, that point made some obligation because there is an agreement between the both of the parties. Even the narrow definition, contract is need two parties, not only one or more individuals, commit themselves to one another. So we can already know who the parties are. So, like I said before, that the parties in the contract, it can be more than two parties or more than two parties, but in here there is some parties that can we understand. No, we already know that there in Indonesia we know legal entity or badan usaha in here, and individuals and CV in here the kind of legal entities as a company, CV and PT, they can did the contract with the individuals or person by person, individual by individual, company with company, and others. So we can make a classification of the contract first. Contract by the bilateral contract and the unilateral contract. Bilateral contract is have the characterized that the reciprocal presentation which are independent, in that if the one party fails to perform, the other party is not bound of the perform either. And about the unilateral contracts, in here are those which imposes an obligation to perform upon one only of the parties to the contract. For example, the contract of the donation. Now we move to the principle of the contract. First, it's about the consensual principle. Second is about the freedom principle. The third is facta servanda principle, and the fourth is about the good faith principle. What does the principle means in here? The principle means that the basic norm which is extracted from the positive law. So it can be mentioned that there is a regulation that regulate that there is a principle that is included in the term of the contract. So I can mention that the principle, it must be done, it must be did, it must be there is in the contract, or before the contract, or when do the contract, it must be implemented, the principle of the contract itself. Now consensual principle. Consensual principle in essence of contract in itself implies a meeting of mind. And from the moment this is about the freedom of the contract, in here the freedom of the contract can be understand as the we free to make a contract or not, we free to make a contract with anyone, and we free to determine the contract and the terms of the contract itself, and then the form of their contracts, or written, or the type of the contract, and determine the choice of law of courts. So in here, the freedom can be means that we have a lot of agreement by, if we are looking for the parties, if we are looking for the substance of the contract, we have the right, or we have the free to do. Even it's not contradict with the law, I think we have the freedom itself, or the freedom of the principle itself is still done. We move to the facta servanda principle. It means that all agreements that are made legally shall be applied as the law between the parties thereto. Or here we know that if we make some agreement, there's a right and obligation, so it's legally binding to the both of the parties. So the parties must do the action, or do the right and the obligation, and not break not break the what kind of the agreement that done before. So it can be called that legally solved apply as the law between the parties. So the agreement itself become the law to the parties, become the kind of the regulation that must be done by the two of the parties. Like we know acts that did by the society in the Indonesia or undang-undang, it must be done by the society. Of course, in the term of the contract, the contract itself as an legally or the rules that must be obeyed by the two of the party, because the contract itself is binding as a law, I think. And then it's the good faith principle, or in Indonesia we know as an itikat baik. So in here I can be said that the contract must be the good faith principle, because we are know that the content of the principle is not breaking the rules, and the subject or the object in the contract is not breaking the rule. Like if you make some agreement about the drug, of course it's not allowed by the government, so the content of the contract, it must be not contradict with the law. Or sell and purchase some car, it's okay. And if we are have an like borrow something and make an agreement, it's okay, because there is a good faith, or there is no intention to violate the law in Indonesia. I think the good faith principle itself is must be there is, or did by the two parties when make the agreement, and because to save the the subtext and the legitimation of the contract, or if we bring to the court, if the good faith principle it full, so I think the kind of the evidence that in the contract, I think it can be as an evidence and strong evidence in the court. I think it's enough, because I already explained about the what the obligation, what the contract, and what the principle of the contract, of course. And I before I explain about the element of the obligation, so I think it is enough. And if the if the explanation before not too perfect, or not too good as you, so we can sharing, or we can discuss it about the obligation, and see you in the next video. I think it is enough, and assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you. Hope this video will happy. And